G'day everybody, how you going today? It is so good to see you. I do hope you are super well. Today we are talking about the very exciting brand new Viltrox for Z mount. This is the 135mm f1.8 lab lens. Now this lens has been out for the Sony mount just for a couple of months. We've heard absolutely fabulous things up against its Sony counterpart, the 135mm 1.8 GM. How does this lens fare on the Z mount? This right here is the first autofocus third-party native Z mount lens for the Nikon Z system. Autofocus. Big deal. Viltrox reached out to me and said, would I like to take a look at it? And I said yes. And since then, Viltrox has just gotten better and better. With every release, all of the imperfections that we might find in a lens just continue to be more and more suppressed. Until we got to the Pro lenses. This was a line of lenses aimed at APS-C. I worked with both the 75mm and with the 27mm. These were both 1.2 lenses, but Viltrox didn't stop there. The next big step is the lab lenses. And the first lab off the rank, see what I did there? The first cab off the rank in the lab lens range. Just make sure you haven't had too many drinks if you're trying to say all of these words back to back together in a sentence that makes sense, is the 135mm 1.8 lab. For E, for Z, and maybe one day for RF. Who knows? Anything could happen. Now, as I said in the opening, this lens has been highly regarded up against the E-mount 135 1.8. But as we know, Nikon released an extraordinarily special lens when it came to the 135 1.8 planar. This video will not be a comparison between those two lenses, because this lens, quite frankly, sits in a place of its own. I don't think it's fair comparing a $2,500 USD lens versus an $899 USD lens in my first impressions video. And that's why you need to subscribe right now and come back and see the comparison between the planar and this lens right here. And coming after that, I will be getting the Sony GM 135 f1.8, the Viltrox and the planar all in one video together, all on their native systems. That will be a very interesting video, but a video for another time. Today is about celebrating the Z mount launch. The build quality is absolutely magnificent. Viltrox, they just keep stepping up. There is one thing about this lens, it is a heavy lens and it's actually slightly heavier than the planar. This is around 1200 grams. We do have an aperture and it does click, but you can also turn the click off. It's great, it's there, doesn't have a lock on it, but it doesn't matter where this ring is, it doesn't dial to any aperture. It doesn't matter whether you're at 1.8 or wherever you are, you can override what you're doing here with the dial at the front. So that still works great from my perspective. Otherwise, the build is absolutely fantastic. We do have a function button here on the top, function button on the side. Another thing that I think is pretty cool is the ability to set how far. Like you see with the telephoto lens, how far do you want the lens to focus? Do you want it to be a far focus, sort of medium to far, or do you want it to be the full range of focus, or do you just want it to be the short end of the focus, the more macro end? That to me is actually something really useful, because if you're just shooting action in the distance, the lens is never going to rack all the way back to its closest focus. And that's great. It saves time. It's very rare a use case where you're focusing from here, like on the closest focus, to somewhere near infinity. And so usually the lenses take a little bit of time to get through those first few feet, that first meter, and then they're very fast at focusing from, say, 5 meters to infinity. That is very quick. Thus, having the switch that limits that range, what a great idea. And of course, we have the usual AF and MF switch here at the front. And of course, a beautiful, reasonably dampened. I probably would have dampened that a little bit more, but a reasonably dampened autofocus ring. Of course, it comes with this lens hood, and beyond that, I think the build is fantastic. What is this lens designed mostly for? And I would say that people who are doing birding and action, people, portraiture, I will use and can use a lens like this in any situation, including landscape, streetscape, and so on. But I think portraiture would be one of the most likely scenarios for it. And for portraiture, the autofocus system in this will outrun a human, absolutely no question. Image quality wise, this lens is very, very good. The first test that I engaged in was the chromatic aberration test. I just simply can't see any in that first test. Viltrox over the last 4 or 5 years has done an extraordinary job of minimizing chromatic aberration, whether it's purple or green. It just seems to be gone. Now, I'm sure that we can find a use case or a situation where we might be able to make it appear, but I didn't see it in my testing to date for this first look video. This is not a full review. And that's pretty amazing because the way I shoot, those sort of things will become obvious quite quickly. But when we're talking about sharpness, this lens is very, very sharp. The bokeh looks great. Let's take a look at some of the images in Capture One.
Now, I've been lucky enough with Viltrox to have this lens for a little while, and of course, the longer that I have any piece of hardware, the more I can test it across more conditions, more use cases. I was lucky enough to be up Mount Hotham when the Peaks Challenge bicycle ride was on. It covers 235 kilometres of alpine terrain, over 4,000 metres of climbing, which they say is equivalent to the mountain stage of the Tour de France. These cyclists are working very hard and they are moving at speed. This is a great test for this lens and its autofocus and how it couples with the camera. Because this is a pre-production lens, sometimes the metadata would come across as it being a 16mm. Clearly this is not a 16mm lens. But what we can see is as this cyclist is coming through, he is absolutely staying in focus. That's very impressive based on the speed that he was moving, and this is all just done with eye detect. Very happy with this lens from an autofocus perspective. If we look here at the metadata, we're shooting on the Z8, and for some reason it appears correctly when we're looking at the actual metadata. Here it is, the Viltrox 135. Even so, it's still saying 16mm down the bottom there. Unusual, but this is what happens when we're working with pre-production. Straight off the bat is just simply how sharp this lens is, how well it's performing. What we have there is pixel for pixel, very sharp, beautiful color rendering on the Z8. And we'll move through all of these quickly because it's the same story over and over again. This is a very sharp lens. It renders well. We don't really see chromatic aberration or purple fringing very much. And it doesn't really matter what you throw at it. It's just happy to do it. This is just showing a little bit of what the bokeh looks like without there actually being lights, which is what we see most of the time in the background. You can have a bokeh that is not about lights. That background rendering from my perspective is very, very pleasing. We are towards the edge of the frame. We are shooting at wide open, handheld at 1/320th of a second ISO 64 on the Z8. And you can see that on the left here. We're still sitting on the Z8. It still says 16mm down there, but we are definitely using the Viltrox 135 Lab, as we can see where the orange is. We are on the edge of the frame here. Check it out. This is the edge. And that rendering there, pixel for pixel, to me looks very sharp. It's a great result. And this is what Viltrox says, that it's sharp through the field of view, even wide open. Straight into the sun, straight in the sort of position we would expect to see fringing, flaring, ghosting. I don't see any. It's a very, very good result in these very harsh conditions. Now, when we talk about sharpness and we talk about that bokeh, you can see here in this type of image just how beautiful it looks. I've processed that by putting an extra bit of contrast in there, but we can pull that back and make it look very different. It is a very pleasing result. Interestingly, RAW editors all work a little bit differently. And when it comes to Capture One, you can pull back this clarity slider, and we're still sharp, but as you can see, it's making it less contrasty, less crunchy in the background there. But of course, we are still sharp. What a great result. I'm very impressed, but wait, it gets better. We have images like this, and this is where you can truly see the depth of field, and just how well it works. And we can see here just the separation between these two people that are standing next to each other. 135 at 1.8, even with something like 1 foot 30 centimeters between them, there is a difference in the focus here. We are at 1/200th of a second, and we can see that we're still getting a great job, which leads me to talk about stabilization. The stabilization on this lens works very, very well in stills. In video, I think it's probably not quite as strong as the Nikon offerings, but I do think this is something that can be addressed with firmware. And of course, we are still dealing with pre-production firmware. And I've spoken with Viltrox about this, and they've informed me that they are continuing to tweak the firmware, and this was as recently as a week ago. We can always expect improvements when it comes to these sort of situations, but when it comes to stills, absolutely fantastic. When shooting something in the foreground, even so, this fence was probably a fair distance, something like 20 meters, 60 feet from me. You can still get the background out of focus. And to me, I love the fact that that background looks a little bit like it's a painted canvas. That's gorgeous to me. Another version of the same thing. That capacity to be able to isolate a subject, tell its story, and the background to still tell its story, but it's more impressionistic. It's not as literal. And I really love the capacity to be able to create that separation and that in-camera editorial. Everything is super sharp. There is nothing that you wouldn't like about that render and what you're getting there. And straight away, everything falls off and looks very interesting in those out of focus areas. Sharp, bright color rendition is fantastic. The idea of this image was the sun. It's directly behind this object. If we go into 100%, the indications of purple fringing they're pretty minimal. This, again, to me, is a fantastic result. And in this image, if we look in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, I haven't applied any purple fringing or fringing reduction. Most RAW converters these days, they are extraordinarily good at doing that in post-processing, but as we can see, this is extraordinarily good at doing it in camera, on the sensor, via the glass. That's a great result when we're looking into the sun and we have all these harsh, high contrast metal objects. I just love this image for the color and the juxtaposition and the craziness, and of course the Viltrox is handling it with aplomb. I'm pretty sure that every image that you're going to see is shot at 1.8 unless I accidentally changed it to something else. This lens is performing at a high level every time you see an image. ISO 64 1/13,000th of a second, f1.8. This is a really high level of rendering we can see across all of these images for what I think is a very well priced lens. This image is at APS-C and I've gone into 100%, and we can just see what a lovely result of this little bird here. I am not a birder, so I don't profess to get the best birding images, but it's certainly possible with this lens. I just love these sorts of images. I don't know why. I think it's the mixture of the color, the mixture of the cacophony of objects, the juxtaposition between the finished and shiny skyscrapers, as well as the construction in the foreground, yet we're showing some of the natural world in here as well, which includes that cloud that just happens to have placed itself in perhaps the perfect position. Perhaps it could have been higher, but you know, I haven't yet worked out how to control clouds in the real world, and I won't be using AI to do that. The Australian extreme summer light, it's very harsh, and again we can just see how pixel for pixel how well it's handling that. It looks so lovely. What a great texture. Everything looks sharp, and then that fall off is so quick, and I love the way those thorns are falling off and the way that that looks. You can see I've done very little to this image. I've pulled up the shadows and the color has been slightly changed. This is the famous Melbourne bathing boxes, and we can just see time and time again how well this lens performs across so many use cases. But wait, there's more. On the thumbnails on the right, this is the 135 being used. I'll just show you for an event I photographed. There it is on the Z8 with the Viltrox. I got approval from this gentleman so you could see what a portrait looks like. I shot the entire event with the 35 1.2 and the Viltrox 135. 35 1.8. In the case of both lenses jumping between full frame and DX, event photography, you don't need more than 20 megapixels or 19.4 megapixels. It is more than enough. And of course, when we go to full frame 35mm, we're getting 45 megapixels. It's allowing you to do that with these extraordinary low light capabilities. Right now, I'm not aware of a 70 to 200 mil lens, for example, that is 1.8. And this allows me to shoot at 1.8 and jump between 135 to 202 field of view equivalent, still get captures that are high enough res for the client because they're just using them for social media and brochures. These things are never going to end up on a billboard. It's a great result. So I used this lens real world. I don't have approval to show all of these other people, but you can just see the huge number of images that were taken, and it performed perfectly in this scenario. An absolutely wonderful result. It shows my level of confidence with this lens, the fact that I'm using it in a professional scenario. After that event, we got to here, which was the setting up of Moomba. There was a lot of haze on this evening. That's why you can see the sky is grey, because the light, the ambient light, was bouncing up into the haze, a sort of a fog. It was a high level of humidity, but I just love the way it's handling this handheld. Now have a look in the bottom left-hand corner where ISO 640 handheld at 1/15th of a second at f1.8. This is a beautiful result. These are beautiful renders. The fact that you can even do this. And if we go back to the adjustments, you'll see here that I'm doing, again, very little to these images. I mean, have a look here. The detail on the carousel, the detail on the chains. We are pixel for pixel. Fantastic result. At night, handheld, 1/50th of a second, ISO 640, f1.8 on the Z8. And just look at all of the detail in the sign and the cobwebs. The world we live in today with mirrorless lenses, just in general, this is a general statement. Unbelievable that we can do this sort of stuff. And we get this sort of result at night time. It is superb. Love the fall off, love the color, love everything about it. Caption One does not know this lens. It doesn't know this lens exists yet at the time of me recording this. I suspect once this lens is formally released for Z mount, this will all change. Beautiful renders in the high country of Victoria. Just fabulous results. This is a shot through a windscreen, a snapshot that I very quickly took as this car came around a corner and came towards me. Showing depth of field and color. I've deliberately underexposed this just simply as a look. That's the top there of Mount Hotham, I believe. That's the highest point, which I walk up to a little later. Love this image. I've desaturated it a little bit, as you can see in the top left there. These are just gorgeous, impressionistic views. It shows that even at 135mm, you can use these lenses for landscapes, cityscapes. More cyclists as they came flying at me, and the results here are fantastic. Just around sunset as family and friends climbed to the top of Mount Hotham. What a beautiful render. This lens can do whatever you want to do. We're at 1/25th of a second, f1.8, ISO 64 handheld. High country. Now this is interesting. This is a picture of a fire that was going on a couple of hills away. Some very interesting smoke earlier in the day came out of that region. Just beautiful moments. Editorial or lifestyle type of photography. We're now something like half an hour after sunset. It is very dark. ISO 2500 at 1/40th of a second at 1.8. Still getting these fantastic sharp captures. I've done no noise reduction. I've done almost nothing to this file except saturate it a bit to enhance those brake lights. And I just love the results. We're now at ISO 1600. That might be one of my favorite shots. Final day on Hotham, and these just beautiful classic sort of clouds going on. This is just a lovely render. Final couple of images from this lens. A very, very wet day in Melbourne, and its capacity to just give you everything you want from this sort of focal length. I love what this lens is capable of. I think at the price point that it's coming in at, it is offering a great deal of value. And as we can see, and as we've heard from the E-mount version, this is a very high quality lens. It is well worth considering. Now we need to talk about the fact that this lens has a screen on top of it, and as we can see, it shows focus, it shows aperture. I think it's really fun having screens on top of your lenses. I use them, not very much, probably something like 5 or 10% of the time, but when I do use them, I do think they're actually very, very helpful. This is a color screen. Now, if you are interested in this lens at all, there is an affiliate link below, which does help support the channel and also does provide a discount. This is direct from Viltrox.
I think what's super exciting about this lens is the opportunity for Z-mount users to jump into a native third-party 135. I do believe that it is different to the Planner, and it should be different because the price differential is something like 3 times. Please do join me in my video where I do compare this lens and the Planner. It has 14 elements in 9 groups. Its viewing angle at full frame is 19.04 degrees. The apertures are f1.8 to f16. Number of aperture blades is 11. Minimum shooting distance is 0.72. The focus motor is a voice coil motor. Magnification size is 0.25 times. The lens size is 93 millimeters by 145.7 millimeters. And the front element filter size is 82 millimeters. The front element has multi-coats, which I don't know what they are, but it has multi-coats, and it is resistant to dust, splashes, stains, and water, and thus built to perform in outdoor and difficult conditions. Viltrox state, and I suppose this is probably backed up with reviews from people like Gerald Undone, that this lens has outstanding resolution and it is sharp from the center to the edges. And this is at maximum aperture. You can switch between near and far focus in just 100 milliseconds. The lens is weatherproofed with an advanced dust and moisture resistant design. This body here is made of magnesium alloy for durability, and well, they say lightweight, but at 1.2 kilograms, I suppose it's not lightweight, but lightweight relative to what it is. Relatively. Of course, the lens has a USB-C port so you can update the firmware. And if we look at these MTF charts, well, that is pretty damn impressive. There are 4 ED lenses for reducing chromatic aberration, 2 HR lenses to minimize distortion and enhance image quality. And Viltrox are doing their absolute best to minimize focus breathing. All right, everybody, well, there it is, the brand new 135 f1.8 for Viltrox. This might be a very exciting alternative for some Z-mount users who are really interested in the 135 1.8 lens, but want to get something a little bit cheaper than a planar. And there it is. This is a really, really good alternative. I will put those 2 lenses side by side in the coming weeks, and I look forward to showing you the outcome of that. Also, we are hearing that there are more lab lenses to come on Viltrox's roadmap. This includes a 35 1.2, a 50 1.2, and an 85 1.2. Now, we hope that they are coming for Z-mount as well. And again, this is really interesting to see how they compare up against Nikon's 1.2s, and will these be a viable and realistic alternative? I think considering the price differential, for some, it may well be. I really look forward to bringing you some of those lenses in the future as well. All right, everybody. Well, let's talk about this lens. Is it going to be good enough for you? Is this the version of a 1.8 135 that you might get? Let us all know in the comments below. Let's talk about it. Tell me why you like it. Tell me why you don't like it. What are the pros and cons from your perspective? I'd love to talk to you more in the comments below. All right, it's been so good to see you, and if this is your first time here, I'd love to see you again. So please do subscribe, please share, and please like. All right, bye for now.